second speaker of this afternoon is Martijn de Waal, and I'm very happy to welcome you here. So Martijn de Waal is a writer, researcher, and strategist based in Amsterdam. He worked as an assistant professor at the Department of Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam, and he also co-founded the Mobile City, mobilecity.nl, which is a think tank on new media and urban design. If you don't know the website, you should really check it because it's a gold mine of all kind of stuff and thoughts about all those topics that we are discussing today. This is where I know Katja from, actually. So. And he also runs the Public Matters, which is a bureau that carries out research on the role of new media in society. And yeah, that's most of what I can say about you. So he also does books, as you can see. And his talk is called Idealizing the Smart City, which is also projected behind me. So you know everything. You can start.
Well, thank you for the introduction and for the plugs for the Mobile City network as well that I co-founded together with Michiel de Lange in the Netherlands. We've been running events like this as well, so it's a great honor for me to be here today and enjoy all the presentations. This is the book that I wrote. The English version came out a few months ago, but I'm not going to talk about the book that much because Yannick asked me to talk about an article I wrote a few years ago about urban ideals. So how is it that we imagine the city? What kind of ideas do we have that the ideal city should look like? And how does that, how do these ideas, how are they transformed into the design of new media practices? And that's mainly what I will be talking about today. But before we do that, I'm going to take a brief detour because I saw this picture this week in the newspaper. I think maybe more of you have seen it. Anyone know where this is? Yeah, it's Venice. It's the Biennale. It's an installation by Rem Koolhaas, Dutch architect. And the point that he wanted to make is that, before architects could use the ceiling to have beautiful decorations, etc., and we could use the whole building, but now, it doesn't show so well in the light, but we have sort of 1 meter of extra technical stuff, all these installations that sort of block out our role as architects. And I'll cite him. He said, the ceiling used to be decorative, a symbolic plane, a place invested with intense iconography, and now it has become an entire factory of equipment that enables us to exist. A space so deep that it begins to compete with the architecture. It's a domain over which architects have lost all control, a zone surrendered to other professions. So architects are not alone anymore in the constructing of buildings, of spaces, but there is all these other professions as well that you have to compete with. And this is just, the ventilation installations and the air conditioning and everything. And you can imagine that what we're talking about here is, a whole different layer that's added to there. From all the Wi-Fi routers that might be there up to the GPS satellites up in the air that help us define our position within the building. So you could say form no longer follows function, but function starting to follow software. The software layer is really starting to become an important aspect of what's happening in that space. And then you can whine about that and you can say, oh, we poor architects, we can't do what we want anymore. But you can also look at it as an opportunity. You can also say, okay, if we have those new layers, then what actually can we do with it? And that brought me to the Biennale 2 years ago, because that had a very different motto. It was curated by David Chipperfield, if I remember right. And he said, this was one of the images at the beginning, architecture is not about the conditions of design, but about the design of conditions. So rather than sort of talking about how we are being curtailed with all these new conditions, let's start to think how we can make use of these new technologies to design conditions. For example, in this example, it's an empty space, but it's also a condition for a mass rally. Those are all people that are gathered together there. And that's I think that's my point of departure. Can we think of, urban design, whether you're an architect or an interface designer or an artist, from that idea, can we start thinking about the design of conditions? And then I hear you thinking, sure, but the question is, of course, conditions for what? And that's what I would like to talk with you about today. And I want to do that through this idea of what's been called urban imaginaries. So various ideas that we have of what a city is. I have a bit more complicated definition as well, written by Jude Bloomfield. She says, urban imaginaries focus on sensory and emotional experience and practices, on the imprint of collective memory, on imagining how the city could be, on the different, often conflicting social constructions of the city's future. So we have all these ideas in our heads what a city could be, and those ideas are not just ideas, they become performative, right? They're being used by designers or by policymakers to actually start designing cities or policies or what have you. To make it concrete, maybe this is one of the most influential urban imaginaries of the last century. Does anyone know what it is? It's Ebenezer Howard. He made this diagram of the city of the future at the end of the 19th century, and he called it, the book in which he made this diagram, he called it Garden Cities of Tomorrow. And there was a reaction to the industrialization which brought about dirty cities with very poor conditions for the working class. So he said we should do it completely different. Rather than having all these slums, he said we're going to design a group of slumless, smokeless cities. So all these little circles, there are settlements, and in between there is all these green lands. So there's lots of open space, lots of green space for the people to live there. The point that he made, and I think that's important to make one, it wasn't only about designing sort of a environmental friendly way, so you wouldn't breathe all the smoke from the chimneys. For him, it was also a political blueprint. For him, the garden cities wasn't just a way to lay out the city physically, but if you read his book, he also has this whole idea of how the workers that were living in those cities should have a particular say in the governments of those cities. And I think that's interesting to bring that out, because when we talk about urban ideals or urban imaginaries, sometimes they are presented in one way, but they have been taken up in completely different ways. Because I think this picture is, as Peter Hall has described it very beautifully in his book, Cities of Tomorrow, it's been very influential because planners from, in much of the 19th century have been influenced by this, and they started planning suburbs, nice, green, open spaces, but they didn't really care about his political ideas about it. So they took over his physical ideas, but they sort of the more radical political ideas that were in there, they sort of gotten forgotten. So in a way, this image has become very influential, but not in the way it was intended to be. So that's something I think we should keep in the back of our mind when we talk about urban imaginaries. I've also brought a more contemporary urban imaginary. This one, Tobias also showed a picture of it. Songdo, one of those cities that's been heralded as a smart city, built in Korea, not so far from Seoul. Talking about imaginaries, I have a small clip that shows how the city was actually marketed and sold. So let's have a look at it.
The difference between 99 and 100 can be small, but the U-Life values this small difference. Now, it's time to begin having a 100% safe life. You can protect your precious children anytime, anywhere using video monitoring. Driving becomes safer with intelligent navigation services that switch automatically between road navigation and parking information. Intelligent CCTV service uses motion detection technology to identify suspicious activity and automatically informs related organizations to deal with the situation promptly.
Well, this goes on and on and on. As you can see, it's a very different way, right, of imagining a city. This is not a city where workers also govern their city in a nice, ecological, friendly surrounding. It's a city where the citizens are most of all consumers, and there is a system that guarantees them 100% safe life, thanks to all these new technologies. What's interesting is, I'm sure you've seen some of these images or maybe even some of these film clips. I went to Songdo about 1 year ago because I wanted to sort of experience how it was to live in a city like that. But what I found there was that there was actually no smart city technology there. There was nothing that really worked at that moment. Even though, if you read the newspapers or the magazines around the world, journalists were writing stories like this, how in the future Songdo would be really the smart city because we have sensors that guide the traffic lights and there are sensors in the sidewalks, and then when people are walking and they're passing by, then the light will turn out and it will be all environmental friendly and you can find your parking spot just when you need it. But there was nothing there. There was still the promise that it would be there tomorrow. Or maybe the day after tomorrow. But the only thing that actually worked when I was there was when you were throwing out your trash, then you needed a chip card, so to open the trash, and then it would measure the weight of your trash, and then I think you got billed according to the amount of trash that you threw away. And of course there were also, the video, the security cameras, they were there everywhere as well. My point is not to diss Songdo here, because in a way it's, if you walk there, it's not an unpleasant city really. The thing is that I wanted to bring out is that this urban imaginary is very powerful. The images are going all over the world, but it doesn't exist any more than the garden cities of Ebenezer Howard existed. And yet, governments all around the world start emulating this idea of, this is what we want. We also want a smart city, and build it, and use some of the rhetoric that's in there. So if we look at these two urban imaginaries, I think this term we can look at it in two ways. First of it is an idea of what a city is. So what is a city? Is it first of all a bunch of infrastructure that we have to manage, or is it a political community, or is it maybe something else? And then there is also an idea of how it should function, right? You can say the city is a bunch of infrastructure, and the way that we manage it, you can do it in different ways, right? You can say we're going to manage it as efficient as possible, and we're going to do it by selling service to individualized consumers, or you can say no, we're going to run it as a commons, which is a completely different way of approaching how you roll out your infrastructure. And so this whole idea of urban imaginaries is an idea of what a city is, and how it should function. And why am I bringing them out? Because I think it's interesting to turn around the question, because usually we say, we're used to looking at the effects of technology on society, but if we look at urban imaginaries, we're sort of turning it around. We're looking at the effects of society on technology. What is the discourse that we have on our society, or thinking about our cities, about our technologies, and how is that turned into a particular dispositif or an arrangement or an apparatus or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's really important to do that because, if you look at the way that, people like this guy who you probably know, how they talk about these technologies, they use phrases like this. They say it's the magic of software that will connect these devices into a seamless whole, making them an indispensable part of our everyday lives. Right? So this is magic, what's happening here. It's not a particular vision of society, but it's magic. And sometimes we even forget that it's actually a particular vision of society that's being, constructed within these technologies. So I take inspiration from this man, Philip Agra, and he said we should turn it around. Right? He said technology at present is covered philosophy, but the point is to make it more openly philosophical. So what are those ideas about society that slip into our technology, and how are those ideas then operationalized again in society? And I want to do that by looking into three ideas of what a city is in the next half an hour or so of my talk, to dig a little bit deeper in what are those different urban ideals that that we find when we look at our current new media technologies. Because a lot of those new media technologies, they are not revolutionary, coming out of nothing. You can place them in a long tradition of talking about urbanism. So I singled out 3 of them, and that's just, I could have made a list of 5 or 10, so it's in no way an exhaustive list, but I thought these 3 would sort of be an interesting starting point to look at them. So the first one is the city as a bunch of infrastructure, and how do we manage it? The second one is this idea of, and Katia already mentioned that, this idea as the city as a community of strangers, and the third one is this idea of the city as a political community. So there are 3 different ways of looking at what a city is, and the point is not that one of them is, better or truer than the other one. It's just different ways of looking what a city is, and if you look at one of these particular ways, then you see particular things, and then you adjust your infrastructure or technology in a particular way, which also might have consequences for the other 2. But let me get to that. Let's start with the first one, the city as a bunch of infrastructure. And I think this idea is very prominent in many of those smart city stories that we're reading right now. Although the rhetoric is starting to change a bit, right? There's lots of discussion about smart cities versus smart citizens, where it shouldn't be all about technology that's becoming more and more efficient, but we also should give a voice to the people, and also the industrial players who are developing these kind of systems are taking up that rhetoric to a certain extent. But it really is about, a lot of the smart city rhetoric is really about, we have infrastructure, and infrastructure should be as efficiently as possible, and now that we have more data about what's happening where, we can make it more efficient. But not only can we make it more efficient, we can also make it more personal. Right? We can help you find a parking place. We can make sure that you will be guided to the right places where you find the kind of crowds of people that you will like. And there is, of course, a long tradition of thinking about the city as infrastructure, and I want to bring out just 2 examples. They're a bit random because there's a long history, but I think the 2 of them have an interesting, they have different ideals attached to them, and I'll come to this later. I'll show the examples first. So this is our current idea of, the city as infrastructure. But one particular imaginary that has been very influential is this one. The pop-up city by the people from Archigram, and it's again a city that was never built, but that was strongly built on this idea that now we had started to get computers and cybernetic technologies, we could actually change the way our infrastructure is changing. And this is one of their mantras: if only we can get to an architecture that really responded to human wish as it occurred. And what's interesting is that when we talk about the smart city today, it's really about the software layer. So the physical city doesn't really change that much. It's really the software layer that tells us, okay, now drive there because that's where your free parking space is, or go to that bar or that restaurant. But they thought at that time that it was actually the physical city that would change. So this is how they envisioned it. The city would never be finished. There would be cranes everywhere, and the city would be composed of modular pods, and those pods could be moved around by those cranes. And those cranes could do that because the city had a double, and it was called the computer city. And the computer city, according to Archigram, was doing something we would call big data right now, although they were a bit more poetic about it in the way they expressed it. It would collect all kinds of data about us, about what we were doing, about what people were doing in the city, and then it would rearrange those pods according to our wishes as they occurred. So it's all a very infrastructural approach that's been very influential, but it's slightly different, and I'll come to this difference in a bit, because I want to bring out one more infrastructural paradigm going back another 50 or 70 years in history, and that brings us here. The boulevards of Paris, as laid out by Baron de Haussmann. And it's interesting because also there, the whole city of Paris was restructured from an infrastructural paradigm, and the motives of it are also a bit similar to those for the smart city. There are Sanitation is one, health, for example, modernization, so we can be more efficient, we can bring goods to the warehouses in big trucks rather than having to go through all those alleys. Crowd control was very important at that point, optimizing traffic. So again, a very infrastructural way of looking at the city and turning the city into, giving the city also a new form with all those boulevards. So three ways of looking at the city, but all three have a different ideals attached to them. And I would want to take a few moments and go a bit deeper into those, because I think there is an interesting development in that. You know, if we take the first one, this one by Baron de Haussmann, I mean, the ideals behind it, they were, on one hand, they were very much connected to the powers that be. You know, they wanted those boulevards so they could move their armies around and they could get to the uprisings quicker and they could suppress them. So one of them was very sort of, a conservative ideal, but the other ones, of course, were also more tied in with positivism in science, this idea that now we have all these new sciences and we can indeed make our society better and more modern and healthier. And there was another ideal that was very important, and that Stephen Graham has pointed out in his book Splintering Urbanism. He said that what those technologies at that point in history started to do was integrating regions or cities into a whole. The newly founded railways, for example, served that purpose. They were not an act of, well, partly they were an act of commercial exploitation, but for a large part they were also an act of nation building, right? Bringing all the corners of the nation together into this new infrastructural network. And at that time, they were talking about the boulevards in Paris in the same way. These new infrastructures, they were believed to bind cities, regions, and nations into functioning geographical or political wholes. And they were also designed from this principle of universal access. So the idea was to give all citizens equal access to these technologies and infrastructures on the basis of equality. You know, where they were also, these infrastructure were actually assembling us into a nation to which we were all citizens, which was more or less a new idea in that time. But that idea of, bringing us all together through those infrastructure, that's, if you move towards smart city technology, that sort of is waning away and giving ways to new ideas of thinking about that. And that's why I brought out the guys from Archigram, because I think they are at a really interesting sort of curving point where they were also using that technology, but one of their statements then was this: there is no desire to communicate with everybody, only with those whose thoughts and feelings are related to our own. Now, if you read that now, in our days, that sounds very libertarian, right? As if we're all individuals and there's no such thing as society and we should all do our own stuff, right? And this technology is going to give us this personalized version of the city that we find in the smart city ideals of today. But if you read it in that way, then I think you're doing them short. You're shortchanging them, because you also have to see that in the context of that day, where, as Tobias showed us earlier today, it was also a reaction to these totalizing forces of modernism, and the bureaucracy that went with it, and the conformist society, right, that sort of forced us all in sort of the same life path or identities or what have you. And so this idea was actually, being put forward as an alternative to that, to, liberate yourself. So I think at that time it was very provocative, of course, but also a very progressive idea. But if we read it now, that's why I say it's sort of a turning point, because it also leads to, this idea of personalizing the city and having not to do anything with other people that we're seeing in these kind of images, where the city is being sold to us as a service, right? And that's the point of that Stephen Graham and Mike Krang make in the book Splintering Urbanism. They're saying that the way that the infrastructure frames us is now it's as consumers. It's not as citizens anymore. It's not our infrastructure that connects us all together in this society. No, it's a service that we as individual consumers can buy, and we can subscribe to some of it or not. And he goes even further. He says that even leads to new inequalities in society. And he gives the example, for example, of dynamic pricing in tollways, where you have highways, and the busier the traffic is, the higher the prices. So if you're rich, then you can, drive through and you just pay a bit more. But if you're poor, then you're always stuck in traffic. And so it's being sold as a service to those who can pay. And I think that's a very interesting and very valuable critique for looking at smart cities. On the other hand, I think, if we look at ideas and ideals, the very technology that make dynamic pricing possible, which is sensors and data that measure your individual usage of that particular toll roads, because they're cameras that scan your license plate, they see how far you drive, how fast you drive, and then they can send you a bill according to what you've used. That very same technological structure you can also use for another ideal, which we're seeing which is being talked about a lot in these days, to use the technology to reinstate a commons. So organize the technology not as services for consumers, but organize technology as a commons, something that we share together, and where, again, the technology and reputation systems can help us to make sure that we know what everybody contributes, what everybody takes away from this commons, so we can avoid what has been called the tragedy of the commons. And there's a lot of talk about that, although, and I think it's interesting to explore that, although I also think we shouldn't be naive about that. To refer back to Tobias again today, what's being sold to us as, the commons or the sharing economy, sometimes might even be sort of a new way of this neoliberal service economy. And I think, you could say, those guys are dinosaurs protesting to a more efficient way of organizing transport, but I think they also have a point when they say that, hey, we have this arrangement where, we have taxi drivers, and they might or might not be unionized, and they have a particular skill set, and, we shouldn't throw all that away. I mean, there's some value in that, and there might be a new system to make it more efficient, but is more efficient also really more just, or not? And I think those technology, when you look at infrastructure, gives some ways to organize it in more just ways, but I think we also shouldn't be naive in that. So, to summarize it up, the city, we can see it as a bunch of infrastructure, yes, but to what purpose and to whose advantage is that infrastructure working? Number 2. The city as a community of strangers, and that's a point that was brought out earlier today by Katia, and some other people have said that. Jane Jacobs has been cited today, and also Richard Sennett, for example, who says, a city is a place where people can learn to live with strangers, to enter into the experiences and interests of unfamiliar lives. So the basic condition of living in the city is that we're always surrounded by people that we don't know. And that's also the reason that we are in the city, because those strangers, they might have something to offer for us, they might have a job, or they want to buy some of the stuff that we're doing, that we want to sell, or maybe we're looking for a romantic love interest or whatever. So that's why we're there in the city. Those strangers are opportunity, but we also have to relate to them in a particular way. And what Jacobs and Sennett and some others are saying is that what happens in the city, that actually mechanisms emerged as through some sort of a complexity paradigm, if you read Jacobs, that allow people to relate to citizens, to all those strangers in new ways. And what's interesting is that that particular mechanism has also been related to the boulevards. And whereas I said, they were designed for these motives, but what was happening on the boulevard was something else. They weren't just infrastructure. they also became a meeting place, and a mingling of classes started to emerge, because the boulevards, they were really nice and beautifully, and all these very expensive new houses were built there, so it was a place also for the bourgeoisie, newly emerging class, to come and show themselves to the rest of society. But really, right next to those buildings, what you don't see in this picture, were still a lot of the slums. So a lot of the poor people were still living there, and they were also coming up onto those boulevards. So that's interesting if you relate that back to, one of the first slides saying, architecture should be about, creating conditions or designing conditions. You can't always know what kind of conditions you are creating when you're designing, right? This wasn't planned, but public spaces emerged here on these boulevards, and especially if you read Marshall Berman, for example, his book All That Is Solid Melts into Air, he describes how the boulevard was the communication line of the 19th century. That's where people went to show themselves to other people, to mingle, to hear new stories. It was sort of the Facebook of the 19th century, you could say, a place where memes would also replicate, maybe like the parasol was in vogue today, a very physical way of doing that. And this idea of, this boulevard as a place where, people from different classes were coming together to look at each other from a distance, that has become a very important trope or ideal as well in talking about urbanism, and especially a lot of new media art installations are somewhat based on these ideas. And then often this figure is invoked, this idea of the flaneur. So a person who is walking around at those boulevards and sort of looks a little bit there and looks a little bit there, and he cuts and pastes his identity together by taking something from that and taking from something from there, and it's a sort of a new way of life that emerged through which you could also make sense of, all those different people that you were surrounded with. And there's different takes on that. Richard Sennett, for example, he's very critical about this notion of flânerie and the flaneur. And he said that actually this whole idea of, engaging with strangers came under pressure actually when the flaneur emerged as a historical figure, because the flaneur, what he was doing, he was just sitting, sipping a coffee and looking from a distance, but he wasn't really engaging anymore like people would maybe 100 years earlier in coffee houses where they had all these debates about politics or literature or whatever. So the flaneur is often being criticized for being apolitical, right, for being a very private person, almost what Archigram promoted. You don't have to engage with people that are not like you. But I think we're again shortchanging the flaneur if we follow that logic. Because if you read Walter Benjamin, and I know most of his work through René Boomkens, a Dutch philosopher, he said that the flaneur is not just somebody who just wanders around, but the flaneur is somebody who, Benjamin said, he should be searching for dialectical images. He's not somebody who can just sit and relax, but he has the mission, to be a full human being, to really react to what he's seeing. And in the work of Marshall Berman, I think there is two quotes that really describe how that works, based on the work of Baudelaire, who is actually describing some of those scenes. And I think there's two mechanisms on the boulevard that are interesting in respect to what we've been talking about today. And the first one is this idea of the boulevard as a confrontation scene. So a site where you are really confronted with people who are from a different political class or have a different background or identity or etc. And as an example, he takes a poem that Baudelaire wrote about a young couple in love who were sitting at a terrace, and then all of a sudden they're just sitting there and enjoying a glass, and then some poor people are entering the scene who live in the houses back there, and they start glancing at them, staring at them, because they haven't, they're amazed by all this, by the light and by the people with money, etc. And then Baudelaire describes how something changes. He says, the setting that magically inspired the Romans now works as a contrary magic and pulls the lovers out of their romantic enclosure into wider and less idyllic networks. In this new light, their personal happiness appears as class privilege. The boulevard forces them to react politically. This is Marshall Berman, by the way. This is not Baudelaire himself, but it's based on a poem that Baudelaire wrote. So the boulevard, you have these mechanisms where you sort of are forced to react politically. You can't ignore them. You have to take stands, even if you're just sitting there and sipping a coffee. Although it's a different way of engaging politically than, having an engaged, rational discussion in a coffee house. But there's something else happening on the boulevard as well. Again, Marshall Berman describes that, and that he calls a recognition scene. So the other one was a confrontation scene, where all of a sudden you're confronted with people who are different. And here the boulevard acts as a recognition scene. So a scene where you're there, and all of a sudden you're there, and you recognize that there are more people who are like you, because you recognize them because they share, a similar clothing or a similar way of speaking, or you recognize you're not alone anymore, and that can become, even according to Berman, although I think he's a bit naive in that, but he thinks that that can become, out of nothing, sort of a political force. And he describes, for example, this is the Nevsky Prospect, it's not just Paris where all this happened, where in 1876, in such a way, all of a sudden, an attempt to revolution started happening. He said, on the morning of December 4th, 1876, several hundred of the miscellaneous people on the Nevsky will suddenly coalesce into a crowd and converge collectively on the magnificent Baroque colonnade in the front of the Kazan Cathedral. And it's like he describes history's first flash mob. I mean, there's these people, they're just walking there, and all of a sudden they realize, hey, we share something together, let's start a revolution. And of course it's a bit more complex than that, but it is interesting, how this public space works as a way where by looking at other people you start identifying with them, maybe recognizing common traits that you have with them, and then that could lead to common action. Actually, I mean, we see similar things in, this has been mentioned before in Yes We Can, Occupy Wall Street movement, which also said, we are like you. We're young people, and we have a. But I think the second part is more important. And no political party, association, or trade union represent us, nor do we want to do them, because each and every one of us speaks for herself. So again, this is idea that out of nothing, this political public emerges and starts protesting, right? So and what's interesting now is that for a part that still happens by, combining together on the boulevard, but part of this recognition also goes on through the digital layer, through people sending out tweets to each other where people start recognizing that people similar to them are doing something for a particular cause, and that helps them to mobilize. I mean, we can say much more about the role of Twitter in all those gatherings. I'm not going to do that. It's a bit more complicated than to call all those gatherings Twitter revolutions, but I'm going to leave it at that. But I think what's interesting is what we can learn from all of this is that, and that's what René Boomkens has said, is that the boulevard, we can understand it as a first example of a modern public sphere, where through the rituals of everyday lives, we learn about all those strangers, and somehow we also learn how we live together with them. Or as I'm describing in my book, The City of Interfaces, from one of the, I think, the crucial takeaways from the book is that we form urban publics, and public as in a group of people, because we make particular aspects of our life public, as in exposing. That's why I like the word public. It has two meanings. The first meaning is a group of people, and the second meaning is we're, making something, exposing something. And I think they're related to each other, as been shown on these examples. Now, why am I'm telling you all this? Because I think that these whole ideals of flaneurs and boulevards, and I think they play a very important, or they are a very important source as inspiration for a lot of new media art, for example, right now. This is an example from Australia. It's called I-500. I'm not exactly sure if you recognize what it is. It's, this is an architectural drawing. It's a science building in a university in Australia somewhere, and the ceiling is a big data visualization. That's what you're looking at. And the data visualization or the visualization is of data that's being assembled by the building itself. So they're assembling all kind of data, like how many people are inside, how hot is it, how many megabytes are there being downloaded over the university network at this point of time, etc., etc. And they're putting all that together, and then they turn that into some sort of an abstract visualization. So it's not really clear what the color red means, but if you go there every day or every week, then you might start recognizing particular patterns. You might, and that might sort of help you to become engaged with that place. At least that's what they hope. They say in the description of their work, they even call the people who work there, they call them the chemist flaneurs. And this sealing, this data visualization, enables them to amble through the space whilst perceiving subtle rhythms or recognizing complex patterns. So what's interesting is that this whole idea of making your life public is now being abstracted through a data visualization on a collective or aggregated level. And the hope, and there's lots of artworks who do that, right, who visualize collective rhythms of a particular place. The hope is that they somehow represent the collective rhythm that you over time start to identify with. There are some other projects. I mean, this is a very canonical project, I think, Urban Tapestries. Also partly builds on this notion of flaneurs, of people exposing part of their life so we can learn things about each other. The way they did that, this was one of the first projects that was doing that. They designed particular handheld devices, and people were asked to walk through the city and then start annotating the city and writing up stories about maybe some memories they had or some ideas or some political statements that they want. And again, it's a way to make this site of exchange to extend it to the media layer, right? You don't have to be present at the same time anymore to still learn about the stories of others and to form publics maybe with those others either through recognition or through confrontation. And also, again, if you read what they were doing or what they were trying to do, this is from one of their documentations. They say we want to offer opportunities for people to animate their environment through shared knowledge building, and outcomes of this might well have other manifestations, such as demonstrations, communities, parties, etc. So again, a way for letting all these strangers learning from each other. And I think a third example, because this one is really actually in the media layer, I found some of the work of Niels shown this morning, also very much being part of this paradigm, but here it's using actually the media layer as a conversation piece or as a technology that provocates sort of the interaction, where you sort of try to have the interaction between the people and they can learn about themselves and their everyday lives and get to know them, maybe build up trust, maybe initiate something politically, maybe not. So the city as a community of strangers, one very prevalent idea of looking at the city. But again, I think it also raises a lot of questions for urban designers because, it's nice, it's interesting, but it's also a bit vague. How should those people then exactly relate to each other? What kind of normative framework do we find acceptable? Can you ignore each other if you want, or is it enough to tolerate other people, which means okay, you do your own thing, but I'm not going to deal with it? Or do we have to, sort of as Walter Benjamin encouraged us, do we sort of have to engage with those others, with those other people? And I think this is also a very important question. If what's happening there on the boulevard is, a public forming because of people making their life public, and we're doing that through digital media right now, then this question is, I think, very important. So, who controls what we reveal to whom? Do we have to give access for people to capture our data in those collective clouds, etc.? Do we have power to sort of control representations, etc.? And I think the last question is, what's the right depth and skill and commitment of those interactions? Is it okay if we, make a funny art installation which has people just interacting once? Is that an interesting experience for those people? And I think that's perfectly fine. Especially if for a work of art, I don't have any problems with that. But some of these works are being critiqued for. Okay, it's interesting that those works are doing that, but what does it do for? How can you scale that up? Or what does it do for a more long-term formation of publics? What is the commitment that's being asked of the people? That was my second. I'm looking at Yannick now because I have a third as well, but I think I'm running a bit out of time, so maybe we should leave it at this and go to... Yeah? You sure? Can you still bear with me? Okay. So the third one, I'll be a bit briefer then. This is the idea of the city as a political community. And of course, that's also a very prevalent idea in thinking about the city. And this is often the much cited point zero, the coffee houses of the 17th and 18th century that emerged mainly in London, but also in Paris and in Germany. We had similar institutions where all of a sudden a newly formed class, the bourgeoisie, started coming together and started to talk about matters of concern, started to talk about politics. And the ideal, and I have to state again, it's an ideal that wasn't really realized, just like the Songdo Smart City and some of the other ideals, was that everybody who entered the coffee house would be able to participate in the debate on the basis of complete equality. Now, if you look at this picture, it's a bit pixelated, but then you see, of course, all men who look exactly alike, so it wasn't really that inclusive, but that was at least the idea that those people in those time subscribed to. So we have this a public sphere starting to form out of people in those coffee houses starting to discuss stuff with each other. But what's interesting is what Habermas describes is that cultural objects played an important role in those discussions. So it wasn't just people coming together and talking, but the newspapers, which were also invented in those days, they played an essential role in those debates because, and you see it on this picture, people would read out pieces from the newspaper and then they would start discussing that with each other, and then often some of the people who were there, or one of the persons who was there, would write a wrap-up of discussion and then send it to the newspaper again. And then it was printed so that people in other coffee houses could sort of follow up on the discussion. So those newspapers, they were actually more like blogs than our newspapers almost. And some of the newspapers, so The Guardian, that was printed at that time, even had a letterbox in the shape of the lion's head, inside of this coffee house. So you didn't even have to go send your mail, you could just leave it in the letterbox. And that made, what is interesting about it, I think, is that it made those coffee houses into sort of a distributed public sphere, right? Where a conversation would start in one coffee house, it was written up in a newspaper, it could be carried out in another coffee house, and then it was written up again, and so sort of a dialogue could emerge. But the basic ideal of it was, again, everybody could access this discussion, so it was an open platform, and everybody could participate on the basis of equality. And I'm going to make a big skip now, because what you see, I think what's interesting is that, again, this idea of having platforms in our cities where we can bring out issues is very important. So we see it a lot in some art works. In a way, you can, I think Niels also showed us this earlier today, you can see these kind of interventions as such a way of hacking into the commercial infrastructure by providing people a platform on which they could write their own issues. And again, this is really, everybody has access to that, and every statement has about the same worth. The question is, what happens with it after that, of course, when you write your issue. Or this art, you can't really see that. Can we make it brighter? In any way, or else I'll just tell what it is. This is it's a work done by our friends from Aarhus, and it's called Climate on the Wall, and it was a media facade piece, interactive, and maybe you can see it a bit. You see big balloons, text balloons, and below here are all kinds of words, and it worked like magnetic poetry. I don't know if you know what magnetic poetry is. You have little words that you put on the door of your fridge, and you can shuffle them around, and you can make funny or interesting sentences. Sorry about that. And the idea was they had an interactive installation, so if you walked past, you could, so for example here, you see a vague shadow of somebody standing there, and then one of the words there would grow into one of those balloons, and then you could pull the balloons and you could put them somewhere in the sentence. And then inside this building there was a climate conference, so all the words that were outside on the building were also relating to the climate debate. And what I hoped for was that this would be some sort of a Habermasian public sphere, where citizens would use the tool to start having a discussion about the climate debate by, making statements about, I don't know, what they thought would be an input. Do you think that happened? Well, probably not, of course, because anyone who made this kind of installation knows that what happens immediately is that people are going to play it contrary, right? They're going to try to make silly sentences or dirty sentences or what have you. So in that way, the project didn't really bring about a nice debate on the wall. But I think what's one of the takeaways for this project for me was what happened, though, was that people who were standing and looking, they were started to discuss among them, what is this installation? What is it about? Oh, did you know that there was a climate conference inside? Those people did start to have some sort of discussions about the topic. So they didn't really design, the conversation. They rather designed the conversation piece, right? Something that triggered the conversation, not inside the platform that they designed, but somewhere else. So I think a lot of there's a lot more art projects that are trying to do that, right? Trying to come up with a canvas on which people can express their visions or ideas about what the city is. Although I think, and that's the last point I want to make, and then I'm going to round it off. That's what's interesting is that there's something of a Latourian turn happening in the way these democratic installations are being designed. And I'll explain what I mean with that. Latour is Bruno Latour, who has written a very influential piece, I think maybe almost 10 years ago again, where he was writing about democracy and how we, assemble in physical spaces to get like the coffee houses or parliaments to talk about things of concern, but that what actually is important is the object that we're talking about. So the object of concern itself. So it's not so much about the place where we assemble, but it's the issue that he focuses on. How do people assemble around a particular issue? And I think we've seen a lot of art projects that rather than trying to create an arena where people can come together and discuss, like the climate on the wall, we're seeing artworks that using sensors or Internet of Things technology to not so much assemble people in a particular place or let them have the debate, but to bring out the issue of concern itself, to show what we should talk about rather than where we should talk about. For example, I think this is a famous project that does that, Trash Track from the Sensible City, where they asked people to attach sensor to stuff that they were going to throw away, and then they could follow that trash for days or weeks or sometimes even months, because trash travels really long distances. The idea of this was usually trash is out of sight, out of mind, but by tracking it, by visualizing, we can make this issue visible. Or on a more day-to-day level, I think this project of Niels is also in a way doing that, bringing in a particular issue, visualizing it in a particular way, and bringing the issue, using a data visualization to bring the issue out in public space. And I think we're seeing a lot of projects that are actually doing that right now. So that's my I'm also going to conclude now. We've looked at the city as a political community, and how do you design for that? Do you design arenas where people come together with particular protocols? Do you design conversation pieces, something that sort of spikes or sparks a discussion somewhere else? Or do you focus on issues, bringing out issues that people should talk about? And I think there's a lot of interesting work in that last domain, but it also raises another question because and Benjamin Breton and Nathalie Jeremijenko have brought this out nicely in one of the urban technology, situated technology pamphlets. So, it's really nice to have these really beautiful pictures of trash and it's really beautiful for a museum, but how do you move beyond that? How do you move beyond mapping and really engage a public around it? So I'm going to leave it at that. So, as I have looked at 3 different ideas of what a city is, and within all those different ideals that have surfaced in different times in history, and I think all of them are still playing an important part in the way that we look at urban media and new technologies. And my point is that I don't think you should see them as separate categories, but like what I said before, it's probably not a good idea to only look at the city as a bunch of infrastructure, but can you tie that with a way of, how do we manage that infrastructure in a political community, or what does that infrastructure mean for the way that the city functions as a community of strangers? But mainly what I hope to do is really to do this, to give you some thoughts that, especially for those who are starting the workshop, okay, you're going to design conditions, but conditions for what? Which of those ideals do you want to subscribe to and bring out? And that was it. Thanks.
So, a couple of quick questions. Or are we in time, actually? I don't know. We have time for a lot of questions, or just quick?
I'll take questions over dinner or during drinks.
Yeah, too, but... Yeah.
So, when you first showed some of the examples, it was interesting to see the Songdo example from South Korea. And I actually to be honest, I probably you know more about the project than I do, because at the time I was away from South Korea, and I've only been there briefly once, but there has been many criticisms back in South Korea about the project, because it was like a huge investment that ended up being like a ghost city, so it's kind of like a expensive failure. But I think the problem that I saw in it, and probably in many city development, but it's very costly, is that it's always, the nature of this development in South Korea, and probably many other cities, that it's very top-down approach that they take. They don't consider anything about like the people who are actually the local people who are actually involved in this city, but rather they would just think that if you build a system, that people would naturally come in and use it. But as you saw, it doesn't work like that. So, what is your insight in future urban design that could be more engaging, as you spoke later later about moving towards more engaging projects versus just just giving the contents and hoping that people engage.
Well, when I was in Korea, I went to Songdo, but I also went to Hongdae. I don't know if I pronounce it correct, which is a neighborhood in Seoul, which was built as a sort of a sleepy suburb for the rich people in, when was it, the 50s or the 60s? But the pressure on the city was so enormous that now it has been completely urbanized. But the way that happened was completely the opposite of Songdo. It wasn't a top-down master plan of changing that area, but it was people who were doing that themselves, because, first of all, they had the way it was set up. It was, all plots of land, and every plot had a house in the middle and then sort of a wall around it. But after a while, people started to maybe rent out a part of their house, or they started to build a piece next to their house. Then they started to tear down their walls. Then they started to dig really deep cellars, because the pressure was there, and it was getting attractive for people to develop their places as well. But what's interesting is that the government played an important role in that, because with their regulation, the framework they set for that is that they allowed particular ways of urbanizing to happen, and they didn't allow other ones. and they reacted to sort of the bottom-up movement that was there, but they also tried to stimulate it. For example, they had all kinds of rules of, okay, on your plot you can have so many square meters of floor space. But we're seeing that it's getting more urban, so we need urban space. So if people design part of their plot as public space, then they get an extra 20% of floor space or something like that. So we're just setting all kinds of, I mean, you could say algorithms even, or sort of conditions for people in a bottom-up way to organize that neighborhood. And that has led to a very vibrant and interesting neighborhood. It's much more interesting than Songdo, for me at least. Although, excuse me? Hongdae. Yeah. It's a great place. I don't know if that answers your question, but the point is, I mean, even in Korea, I mean, there is a Dutch architect who has written a really nice book about that called Seolutions, from Next Architects, Bart Reuser, and he studied that area, and he said that even in Korea, I mean, that kind of type of development is not really being recognized. Because a lot of the developments, of course, still being steered by, you know, the big companies and the government and investment, and even Songdo. I mean, it's maybe even more an investment scheme than an urban development. People buy an apartment there, just like people bought apartments at the Spanish Costas. You know, not so much because they wanted to live there, but because they thought it would be worth a lot more in the future. But that's of course a completely different discussion. But thanks for your comment.
Another question?
Hello. I'm not sure I can articulate my thought as a question, but regarding the theory of the city as a community of strangers, I have the impression that there isn't much of consideration of the exact opposite tendency for which we have substantial evidence, like, for example, people relocating, they might enjoy being a stranger among strangers, but on the other hand, if you get to observe the different nationalities, like in a big city, you observe, the different national neighborhoods being formed, which is also an architecture issue. Like, for example, in Paris a few years ago, they were arguing, should we encourage or discourage these national identities, neighborhoods?
To flock together. Yeah.
So, because I believe that this, this tendency to the contrary situation is also like a very natural thing for humans in psychological or even biological terms. So, is there a space for this situation in this theory of the city as a community of strangers?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I didn't go into that because of time. But there is different ways of looking at public sphere in the city, and one of them is through a distinction between private spaces, which is your house where you live, and then you have the public sphere, which are those places where you meet strangers. But in between, you also have parochial spheres, and it's a term by Lynn Loveland. And a parochial sphere is a sphere where you have the sense that you are amongst people who are like you. Maybe like an immigrants quarter, or even smaller, a cafe where one particular subculture sort of comes together. And I think that, as you say, from a human perspective, I think you need both, right? You need places where you can, because it's nice to be surrounded by people who are like you. Yeah? It's hard work to continuously deal with strangers who you don't understand. So I don't think there is anything wrong with surrounding yourself with like-minded people. The discussion is, and I think that's the discussion about in urbanism, is, what is the right balance between parochial domains and more public domains? Is it okay for people to, go and live in gated communities and say, okay, we don't deal, there is no such thing as society, take this very libertarian perspective, say, we're just going to live with people who are like us and we don't care about the other people. Whereas other people would say, no, you can't do that because you're a citizen and you have to relate to these other people. And what's interesting, I think, is that this whole theory also about Flannery and the flaneur, the reason Walter Benjamin introduced this wasn't because Flannery was a much practiced thing. actually the opposite happened. He saw exactly what you described, the bourgeoisie sort of recluding in their private houses, not using the public spaces anymore. And for him, he thought that was a bad development, because he thought that, if we have a city as a community, we need people who do relate to each other, even they're not the same. So he introduced the flaneur much more as as an ethos, as something you should aspire to, rather than as something that, as a sociological phenomenon. And I think also nowadays, we see a lot of parochialization, to call it that way, and especially, also again, this software layer really helps us to find parochial spaces rather than public spaces. And I think again, it's often artists and politicians who sort of bring out this idea as the city as a community of strangers as a counter strategy to that. But it's in the end, it's a political debate, right? It's a normative debate about what you think is a just society and how people should relate to each other.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was just wondering if you might be able to comment on whether or not you think the sort of relative modes of resistance that are suggested by the flaneurs up to the kinds of urban interventions being posited by media art are reflective of the relative values and privileges of those doing the resistance. For instance, to refer back to the flaneurs, the idea of walking around with turtles implies an access to turtles in Paris, and to be able to resist the relative speed of the city requires the ability to have leisure at which to go to your own pace, to afford coffee in coffee houses, and then more contemporarily to have access to technology and to mobility and the kind of stratification that Stephen Graham talks about. And if you look at Hong Kong, the rising of the vertical city, of mobility above the street. So what is the impact then of privilege, of access, of education?
No, I think that's an excellent point. I'm not really sure. I see the point that you're making. It's to a certain extent it could also be sort of a luxury, right? To be a flaneur, that you need to be able to afford, or to have all these access to all this stuff. And I think that's very true. And I don't really have a way out of that issue or that problem. It also depends a little bit on how literal you take the issue of flânerie, right? Whether it's really walking around with your turtle, or whether it's more sort of an allegory or a metaphorical way of being in the city and experiencing the world around you. If you take it more like that, then I don't think that's really a privilege. That's something that many people probably could do. But still, no, I think that's a good point you're raising.
A last question, maybe? No? So maybe we'll take a last short break and then have the last presentation of the day.